For the Investing News Network, I'm Brian McGovern, here today from the Lyft Expo show in Toronto with Ashley Chiu from EY. Ashley, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Ashley, why don't we start? Can you offer a quick breakdown of what you do regarding the cannabis space?
Sure, yeah. So I'm actually EY's strategic growth and risk leader for the cannabis and hemp industries. So what that means is that I help companies diversify their business to explore legal opportunities in cannabis or in hemp. And so we work a lot with the LPs on their operations, business process design, corporate governance, helping a handful of them actually list on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. And then on the other side of it, we do a lot of transactions, as I mentioned. So anywhere from competitor analysis to diligence to deal structure to valuations. And so that's kind of our bread and butter in the space.
What would you say is something that so far in 2019 has changed a lot compared to where you were working before with some of these LPs? Now that, like you said, a lot of them are moving to the US in terms of stock exchanges, what is something that has drastically changed so far?
I think people are shocked at the level of investment and the resources that you need to actually build a proper company that is SOX compliant, that is compliant with SEC regulations. And so with the shift to, the US exchanges, there's a lot more liquidity, a lot more investor interest. And so companies want that, and they want to access the American capital markets. And so what we've realized is that, there's always so much going on. Things move so quickly. So if we're able to help them do what we do well, build a finance function, help them with supply chain, help them with their ERP, then they can focus on the strategy and global expansion, all the things that they're concerned about.
In the race for capital, we have definitely seen a shift in terms of the attention for investors. Canadian investors have grown accustomed to the cannabis play, but some recent quarterly results have sort of pointed them more towards the US. The explosion of US stocks has also increased as well.
Mm-hmm.
From your point of view, when you're talking with some of the folks at the Canadian companies, how do you approach this sense of like investors are moving in an attention span more to the US? How do you get them back on board, or how do you say, hey, the Canadian place still has a lot of opportunities?
I think what's really amazing about Canada is because we've legalized federally, it gives us so many more opportunities that companies in the States just don't have access to, right? When we're talking about international markets, when we're talking about research and development, a lot of the human capital and a lot of the knowledge is being built here. And what's great is that that's the part that scales, right? I mean, Canada's not the most optimal environment to grow cannabis, and so they're exploring elsewhere, like Latin America, where the climate's a lot more favorable. But in terms of the Canadian market itself and serving the Canadian market, I think that's where companies are or should be trying to build out their competencies. I think there's a lot of tendency to get distracted by every opportunity in the space where you want to do topicals, edibles, dried flower, beverages, all of these things that maybe you don't have room for in your facility, don't have the competency for, but there are a lot of other partners in the market that are wanting to come in. And so I think it's about building those relationships and being humble enough to know that you can't do everything. So why not get the experts to come in and help? And I think right now in the States, we're seeing a lot of activity. Everyone wants to throw around the word MSO, multi-state operator. How many licenses do I have? How many retail locations? What states am I in? And I think that kind of is a flashback to Canada in like 2018, 2017 maybe. But what I think investors also don't realize is that every time you're acquiring, every time you are entering a new market, you want to build infrastructure, that's all redundant and perhaps not the most effective use of your capital. Yes, you're first to market perhaps, but what about profitability? I think there's a lot of focus on top line growth, but in terms of the business operating efficiently, integration, so that you actually do get to realize those cost synergies, I don't think we've seen a lot of that yet. So I think that's the next wave where, we won't talk about revenue so much as, what is this company doing to become profitable? Because I think, later days and in a more mature industry, that's what shareholders actually care about.
Speaking of profits and revenues, one aspect that the Canadian market is very eagerly awaiting for is edibles. And presented a new study from EY regarding the edible market and some of the consumer trends that we may be seeing moving forward. Can you offer a quick breakdown of what the report was like, and maybe in your own words, what was the biggest discovery from that?
Yeah, so we conducted a study together with Lyft & Co. And we built survey instruments to really talk about, what does 2.0 look like? Who are the people who aren't in the market now? What are their barriers to consumption? What are their, gaps in knowledge? What types of products would they be more comfortable with consuming? And then building up profiles there. So we went out to market after we developed some survey instruments to look at, the Gen Pop, if you want to call them that, who aren't in the market yet, We looked at Budtenders as well across the country to see what they were observing, because we also thought that they're in a key position to educate consumers and also influence their purchasing decisions when consumers don't really know a lot. And what was startling for me was that to find out that 60% of non-consumers currently probably won't enter the market because they have really high barriers, right? Unless something changes with FDA approvals or having a health practitioner support their cannabis use. I think new consumers or potentially new consumers are really looking for that functional efficacy aspect of cannabis, or want to know that that they're not going to get really intoxicated and regret their decisions. And when we look at the knowledge level for THC and CBD, it's starkly low. I think we were looking at less than 15% of non-consumers actually knew what CBD was. And that also speaks to the really big gap, I think, in marketing and promotion regulations. The U.S. Farm Bill passed in the States. And after that, it seemed to be like an explosion of CBD everywhere. It was in all the grocery stores, at all the gas stations, infused in everything. Although not federally legal, that's just the reality of it. I think there's a lot of misinformation out in the market and a lot of hype. And a lot of that is stuff that we don't actually get exposure to in Canada because of the Cannabis Act. If you extract CBD from hemp, all of a sudden you need a processing license under the Cannabis Act, right? So I think our regulations are really telling of how much consumers actually know now and what the barriers are to get them more educated.
Speaking on education, one of the things you talked about in your panel was the discovery of the Budtenders' impact and influence on consumers. This is something that I'm fascinated in terms of how consumers will gravitate towards different kinds of products. One thing that has started to appear more and more are some of these professional reviews as well. Consumers, you mentioned, they're still missing a lot of information. Do you foresee a space where reviews and the comments from the Budtenders, that will really impact the consumers in saying, I don't really know what I want to get, I don't really know what I'm into, and sort of guide me through this process?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one of Lift & Co.'s assets was actually their panel of consumers who were giving reviews, and I think in this digital age, everyone wants to know, am I getting the best? Am I getting the most expensive, the least expensive? Am I getting what I thought I was getting? And I think to reduce those risks of not having a standard product or purchasing and consuming something that maybe won't agree with your body, I think that user-generated content is definitely a platform to help consumers make better decisions. I think so. I think especially since cannabis is such a new product category, there's a lot we don't know. It's exciting at the same time, but hopefully over time, all of this anecdotal evidence that we have can also be supported by science, and that's what I'm really excited about.
And from the company's point of view, it's also fascinating because you mentioned, I believe, 4 out of 10 Budtenders say that they would recommend a product from a producer if they had met up with that producer, if the producer had come to them and say, explain, here's our product, here's what we're trying to sell, or here's the story we're trying to tell with this specific item. So when it comes to that, do you really recommend for producers, for companies, and maybe even for investors to find out, hey, this company that I'm investing in, are they reaching out to these Budtenders? How can they do it a better way to tell the story and so the product can find new consumers?
Yeah, I think there's a thought that, if you throw money at it, then the consumers will come. But I think you actually have to look at what are strategic, allocations of your resources, right? I think more targeted education is really, really important. I think that the Budtenders are in such a crucial, influential position where they're looking at their past experience, they're looking at what's selling, and having information from producers and their brands and their products is really important when you think about the fact that, call it 170 plus producers who have, 5 brands each. That's a lot of information that people just don't have time to sift through, if I'm being honest. And so I think there's a lot of things that licensed producers, license holders can do up front to target these consumers directly before they enter the store, and then within the store making sure that they've provided enough education to their partners in retail so that they're able to communicate the differentiating aspects of their brands and their products.
I see. Ashley, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you very much.
From the Lift Expo in Toronto, I'm Brian McGovern for the Investing News Network. See you next time.